is Justin Eichenlaub. Is that how you say your last name?
Eichenlaub, yeah.
Eichenlaub. Okay, doing 1 for 3 on that. Okay, so Justin is a lecturer in the English department here. He works on Victorian literature and animal studies and is currently completing a book on the origins of modern suburban culture in 19th century Britain. He is at work on a second project on human-animal relations, Darwinism and ethics in the Victorian period.
Take a second to set this up. I circulated a handout. If any of you need a copy of that, I have some extras up here. So I want to start off just by saying thank you so much to Harlan for organizing this conference. It's really, really wonderful, and I've been looking forward to it for a while. So the title of my paper, I sort of cut off the first part, A Bite of Love, and now I'm just calling it Dracula in Guangdong, because I'm actually not talking about this great film, A Bite of Love, which I would recommend to all of you. A great Hong Kong vampire movie, but I will talk about another one. Okay, so just to get started. In his 2011 film, Contagion, Steven Soderbergh presents a controlled, detailed account of the Chinese origins of a zoonotic disease similar to avian flu or SARS. Zoonotic diseases, which include Ebola, HIV, and H1N1, which include those diseases. Such diseases move between species and can thus make the leap between human and animal hosts. Soderbergh's film ends with a step-by-step montage of how China killed millions of humans. This montage is the summation of the film's attempt to track down the origins of the pandemic. The sequence begins with a diseased bat that eats a banana, drops a bit of that banana into a pig farm, leading to an infected pig being bought and sold to a casino restaurant in Hong Kong, where a chef prepares the pig for consumption. While doing so, he is called away to greet a customer, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, and casually wipes his bloody hands on his apron. We're shown all of this very deliberately. He shakes his guest's hands, making her patient zero. This is where the film ends. Soderbergh's film is by the book, gaining praise from reviewers and scientists alike for its accurate depiction of how such diseases are spread. This, combined with the casting of Paltrow and Matt Damon as the leads, makes for an incredibly boring film. It's hard to overstate just how tedious it was watching this film. Part of the film's accuracy, not commented upon by science writers, is its implicit Orientalism, in which narratives of bad Chinese consumption and agricultural practices are the biggest threat to Western health and well-being. I say that its Orientalism is accurate because zoonotic diseases like avian flu and SARS have inspired fear and denigration of Chinese consumption, not just in Soderbergh's film, but in our world. And yet new zoonotic diseases are not an issue of local animal consumption, but of course rather one of global production. The human-animal divide at the site of production and transmission of zoonotic disease is highly charged. Zoonotic pandemics co-locate and highly concentrate cultural, ethnic, and racial differences. The Orientalism implicit in Contagion and in much Western journalism on such outbreaks is all too obvious. But the situation these reports represent, namely epidemics of new disease, is rather complex and cannot be dismissed as mere racist prevarication. I'm inspired by Claire Jean Kim's current work on race and species to investigate these categories' role in animal agriculture at a physical and representational level. I think Kim's work is groundbreaking because she addresses both the violence of racism and the destructions of speciesism. To do this, I begin with a text from my home field, Bram Stoker's Dracula. I taught Dracula this past fall, and it has inspired me to investigate the topics of vampires and animal agriculture through 3 lenses. 1, Orientalist views of consumption and production behaviors. 2, the relationship between vampires and animals. And 3, the uncanny production that zoonoses and vampirism share. Dracula, among other vampires, has long been recognized as a potent metaphor for disease and race. Dracula has been read as a metaphor for tuberculosis in its own time in the Victorian period, and for AIDS, both zoonotic diseases. What has rarely been understood is Dracula's relationship with other animals in Stoker's novel. In fact, Dracula's interactions with and transformations into other animals are often seen as merely confusing, unnecessary digressions in the narrative. His proximity to, so rather than sort of shunt these aside, I argue that his proximity to and truck with animal forms suggests that we might use Stoker's vampire story to help us theorize disease's relationship to animality and race. The novel is rife with Orientalist baggage, useful for our purposes because the zoonotic pandemic is also freighted with these elements. The novel also draws on travel and reverse colonization narratives, making it an even more apt parallel to narratives that spring up around the production and circulation of zoonotic diseases like SARS and, most recently, just a few weeks ago, H7N9. I'm particularly interested today in interrogating the process by which China is constructed as the pestilent, fetid cradle of zoonotic disease. This process is fueled by a one-sided demonization of Chinese consumption patterns in the West, which ignores, for instance, the genesis of such diseases at home in the largest intensive pig production facilities in Iowa and North Carolina, for instance. Stoker's version of vampirism is a good model for how we imagine and diagnose zoonoses as foreign, in particular Chinese, and as a product of an inappropriate mixing between human and animal. China and the Chinese become vampire-like, consuming flesh we see as unfit for human consumption, producing death and disease. Consumption is key here. These vampires and these ethnic others have an insatiable desire for the wrong things. They murder to digest. And yet, as Franco Moretti points out in his seminal article on Dracula, the vampire isn't really a consumer at all, but rather a capitalist producer. As he says, Stoker's Dracula is a rational entrepreneur who invests his gold to expand his dominion. Zoonotic diseases are seen as originating in China because of the supposedly primitive practices of the wet market and a taste for exotic animals. But rather than primitive, Chinese animal agriculture is highly intensive and rationalized, just like that of the US and other Western nations. So, are new deadly zoonoses caused by bad consumption or by perverse production? These questions lead us to the pesky politics of how we should and shouldn't use other animals, questions that normally center on who consumes what and how we judge that consumption. We need to move beyond the unsurprising contentiousness of consumption to focus more on questions of the perverse production of animals for human use, I would argue. Focusing on consumption, whether ending consumption of animals or simply making it more conscious and aware, more in line with welfarist goals, is a cruel optimism. This is Lauren Berlant's concept for a thing that we desire, but which actually stands in the way of our flourishing or success. A less cruelly optimistic object for us to focus on is the production of animals, I argue. Production, not consumption, is the real threat of the vampire. He may produce more vampires. We need to be wary of celebrating the subversive mixing of human and animal in vampirism and in new zoonotic strains. Such recombination can produce violent consequences for both humans and non-humans. We should be honest, I think, about the effects of livestock's amplification of zoonotic viruses, processes at work not just in Guangdong province, but in the United States, in Britain, and elsewhere. As you can see in the article header on the handout, work is being done on this front in the sciences, looking at factory farming, not just in China, but globally, looking at the factory farm as an amplifier of disease strains like influenza. So looking at Orientalist Western constructions of bad Chinese consumption through the lens of Dracula suggests that we ask questions of more contemporary Chinese and Hong Kong produced narratives of monstrosity, animality, and disease. In addition to such analyses, I consider contemporary Chinese perspectives on zoonotic diseases, in part through Hong Kong vampire, Jiangxi, and infection movies. There are many of these films, but I want to end with a quick look at Herman Yao's exploitation film Ebola Syndrome from 1996. Yao's Category 3 film stars Hong Kong film celebrity Anthony Wong as the film's anti-hero, Kai San, who is a murderer and a rapist who escapes to South Africa after committing several murders in Hong Kong. You can see here even from the cover of the DVD all of the all the vectors that are coming to the fore here. Africa, Hong Kong, epidemic, it's all there just in that image. So he goes to South Africa to escape the authorities in Hong Kong. There he works in a Chinese restaurant in Johannesburg. After contracting the Ebola virus, a disease he discovers he is actually immune to, he becomes a super spreader of the disease, dispersing it in part by making burgers he calls African buns out of the meat of his former employers after he's killed them. He chops them up. It's a Titus Andronicus mode. Infected but asymptomatic, Kai returns to Hong Kong. In the film, the city itself becomes the super spreader, its density aiding and abetting Kai's spread of the disease. Unlike Soderbergh's pseudo-rational and even-tempered contagion, in Ebola syndrome, Yao takes the Western gaze of bad Chinese consumption to its limit. In the film, we get an aesthetics of exploitation that approximates the level of the Orientalist disgust at Chinese wet markets and meat consumption. For a recent representative example of this, see the last quote on the handout from James McWilliams. Kai San, then, vampire-like, as he bites his own arm and spews his infected blood onto others, as I'll show you in a second, embraces his disease and his contagiousness, joining with the virus in perverse solidarity, declaring at one point, "Ebola, let's spread together." Hopefully this subtitle is going to work. Okay, so after this, shortly after this sequence happens, the film comes to a close with Kai cutting off a piece of his arm. Oh, I want to go there. Cutting off a piece of his arm before he's killed by the police. They've shot a dart at him. A dog eats the infected flesh, and with a scene of innocent, quiet consumption, the dog here licks the girl's cookie before she eats it. The film ends with another round of zoonotic production, from Kai to dog and back to the human species via the girl. The film's final image of Kai San, this menacing final image, is of Kai San, who regains life by becoming co-identical with the virus. The formal parallel between this final sequence and that of Contagion points towards the way that such montage can be used to depict an epidemic strain that has been sourced and controlled in one case, in Contagion, and one that is still active and menacing on the other. This is an extremely hard film to watch, which I read as a measure of the film's success as a critique of Western, orientalizing views on Chinese consumption. The film forces us to look at ourselves looking at China, and the nexus of food, animals, and disease we tend to see there, we here being the sort of standard American gaze. In its over-the-top violence, the film shatters that perspective, leading us to question individualistic consumer behavior as a viable framework for change. Dracula and Ebola syndrome teach us that instead of focusing on consumption, and this goes for abolitionists, vegans, and animal welfarists alike, we should shift our perspective to the politics of animal production. In this way, we might supersede the defining and obfuscatory binary of the moment. On the one hand, supposedly pure and innocent abstainers from animal use, and on the other, supposedly engaged and realistic users and abusers of animals who are somehow still friends and lovers to them. Thank you.